Hello, I'm Patrick Cox. My newsletter is the Transformational Technology Alert. I write about the transformations that are changing our society and offering opportunities and dangers to investors. I began thinking about this theme and was put in mind of the ancient art of alchemy, which in fact was defined as the science of transmutation or transformation. So looking at this illustration from a famous alchemical text, it's easy to understand why popular culture today, from Harry Potter to Damon Albarn's opera, portray alchemy as either magic or fraud. However, we really should understand that chemistry as we know it came from, both in terms of the word and an actual practice, as alchemy. So alchemy is defined as a series of goals, from the transmutation of base metals to gold, usually mercury, to discover a universal cure for disease and the means of indefinitely prolonging life extension. This concise encyclopedia definition calls alchemy a pseudoscience, but then goes on to note that alchemists made some useful discoveries, including mineral acids and alcohol. In fact, mineral acids and alcohol were the basis of industrial society. On top of that, alchemists discovered hundreds, if not thousands, of substances in nature, experimented with them, and cataloged their characteristics. Nevertheless, we see alchemy as a hoax or a fantasy. And alchemists were portrayed typically as clowns. The problem with that interpretation is the most famous of all alchemists is Sir Isaac Newton himself, the most important scientist in the last several hundred years. In fact, he wrote about this slide, including the miniature lines being produced by the right beast through some process of vaporization. And you have to understand that at that point in history, we had no understanding of molecular chemistry. So today we can do formulas. This in fact is glucose plus an enzyme found in yeast yielding ethanol and CO2. That was impossible for Isaac Newton. But alchemists and chemists could in fact draw pictures of processes. Finally today, we see historians beginning to rethink what alchemy was about, though historian Herbert Butterfield warns that doing so will likely tincture you with lunacy. My old friend Robert Heinlein wrote that one man's magic is another man's engineering. Supernatural is an old word. Arthur Clarke similarly said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's the problem. Great progress in science is often rejected as a fantasy, magic. So let's look at Edward Jenner, who discovered that the exudate from the blisters caught by milkmaids while milking cows when they contracted cowpox was useful in terms of vaccinating against the much more serious disease, smallpox. This is the reaction at the time. It was the beginning of the anti-vaccination movement, which is still with us today. Let's move on to Ignaz Semmelweis, the father of antiseptics. Semmelweis managed 2 birthing hospitals in Vienna, and he noticed that these 2 hospitals had very different mortality rates, which are shockingly high by today's standards. This pink line on top represents mortalities in one hospital, which was run by doctors, men. The much lower mortality rate on the blue line at the bottom is actually a hospital that was run by midwives. Now at that time, doctors wore the same surgical apron all day long, and they were proud of the blood and other substances that they collected during the day, whereas midwives were much cleaner. Semmelweis came to the conclusion that that was the difference, and so he mandated that everybody in his hospitals wash their hands frequently with calcium hypochlorite, and you would recognize it by smell because it's used in swimming pools to this day. The results were astonishing. Dramatic reductions in mortality from post-childbirth infection. Now for this you would assume perhaps that he would be celebrated as a hero. In fact, his writing, his speeches were all interpreted as if he were telling the world that ghosts were migrating from dead bodies on the hands of doctors to kill patients. He was committed to an institution, beaten, and he died of an infection that his own bleach solution could have prevented. And this is despite the fact that Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the great doctors and poets of American history, had written a book describing this very phenomenon and coming to the same conclusion. At the time, however, the authority, Dr. Charles Meigs, dismissed his work, wrote that because doctors are gentlemen's hands are clean. So having finally mastered the principles of germ theory, mostly thanks to Louis Pasteur, we move on to Joseph Goldberger, who was an epidemiologist familiar with germ theory, hired to solve the problem of pellagra or Asturian leprosy in the South. The 4 Ds of Asturian leprosy or pellagra are dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. It was a terrible problem. He came to the conclusion, in fact, that this was not caused by a germ, but nutritional deficit. Experimenting with foods, he was able to prove that he could cure pellagra by altering diet. This was completely rejected, despite the fact that he and other scientists in this field actually held pellagra parties where they ate the scabs of pellagra sufferers. Now, I looked for a picture of pellagra and found plenty, but frankly don't want to show them. Instead, I'll show you a picture of Natalia Estrada, who happens to be from Asturias, because I can. Conrad Elvium, by the way, eventually convinced the world that niacin was the lacking nutrient which would solve this problem, which is where we get Vegemite and other brewer's yeast supplements that are still used to this day. So we move on to penicillin, which really was deployed at the end of World War II, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, if not millions at the time. Since then, it is probably responsible for about a 15-year increase in human lifespan. Discovered in 1928 by the Scot Alexander Fleming. By 1945, the world understood his contribution. He won the Nobel. Not that long. In fact, it was much longer than that. Ernest Duchesne, the French physician, had introduced penicillin glaucum, a variant mold, far earlier. He had written about it, and he was ignored. John Tyndall demonstrated before the Royal Society the action of penicillin. It made no effect. Going back even further to Joseph Lister, he used penicillin in his London hospital. This was astonishing if you consider how much effort went into producing enough penicillin in the modern era simply to treat a single person. And I love this picture of Joseph Lister. The resignation on his face really reflects the fact that he understood how hopeless it was to try to convince an unbelieving public of the efficacy of this extraordinary drug. Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, Australian scientists, they understood that ulcers were not caused by stress, which was the common doctrine. Instead, they knew that the H. pylori bacteria always showed up in the stomachs of ulcer sufferers. So they eventually gave themselves the disease in order to prove that they could cure it. So in 2005, we see they actually won the Nobel Prize. Only a couple of decades, right? Well, in fact, the Greek physician John Lakutis had treated tens of thousands of people successfully as far back as the 1950s. However, the Journal of the American Medical Association rejected his research. He was fined. He was denied patents that would have made him an extraordinarily wealthy man. So Maria Castro is not from Asturias, actually. She's from next door in Galicia. You can see from her hair color that where the Celts came from originally, according to geneticists. And she asks me in my fantasies, so what should we learn from this? Well, repeating Arthur Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I restate this: a sufficiently advanced science is first rejected as magic. When adopted, its impacts overwhelm most people, including policymakers. She says, could you give me an example? And I will give you the example. The biggest transformation in human history is the dramatic increase in longevity. Beginning basically about the time of the American Revolution, the impact of the Enlightenment spread, science was taken seriously. As a result, the average 30-year lifespan is extended to over 80 today in the West. Interestingly, both McCure and McCloskey, economic historians who study this era, point out that all scientists, in fact, were considered clowns until that time. We had the two sides criticizing science, one from an environmental point of view, who believed that scientists were meddling in nature, and the other side criticizing science from a religious point of view, saying it was interrupting and interfering with God's plan. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment and the rise of science managed to make this incredible change due to these three areas which I just described. All of them were rejected, and this is the point. Throughout history, all great discoveries have been rejected, and they still are today initially, unless you think perhaps that the last two administrations are evidence that we have somehow evolved to a higher rational state. This is the demographic transition which has come about due to the scientific revolution. We see birth rates falling, we see much longer lives, we see population stabilizing and then going down as it is all over the West today. We are in fact in a state of depopulation. We have seen infant mortality plummet. We've seen survival rates, however, go up just as well. Birth rates have plummeted. Fertility rates in the West have fallen below replacement rates. Even Mexico now is not replacing its population. The result of this is that everything has changed in terms of the demographics of our societies. When I was born, there were about 16 workers for every retired person. Today, it's less than 3 and falling. A system devised in the 1890s by Otto von Bismarck and implemented in the early 1900s is still in place. This is the result. We're broke. Across the world, in fact, if you look at the root cause of the current economic problems, it is the inability to live up to the promises made by our social service systems for young people to take care of old people. There are far more aged people today with much higher medical costs. At the same time, the number of workers supporting them has diminished to a fraction of what it was only 60 or 70 years ago. So we should talk about overpopulation, which we've been told our whole lives is going to end in our doom, when in fact we are now in depopulation. Even the third world, even the developing world, in fact, is going through this same transformation. This is the demographic transition. We should also think a little bit about peak oil, which is also our doom. Today, in fact, known reserves of petroleum products in the United States are higher than they've ever been, and they're really much higher than that. So we should talk a little bit about doom. For one thing, I'd make a lot more money if I were joining the parade of doomsayers who say the world is ending. On the other hand, it's not. If we look, however, at people like Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren, the President's science advisor, we see that people don't suffer for having been wrong. In their case, they predicted the end of the world through starvation and overpopulation in the 1980s. When that didn't come to pass, they simply moved the date outward. And they're still taken seriously. This, by the way, is a good example of robotics. And the energy explosion that I told you about earlier, in fact, will drive this forward, because America today is the cheapest source of industrial chemicals and power. We're going to see the trend of outsourcing reversed as smarter computers begin to do things with robotics that previously required humans. This is Nicole Galicia, and she's not actually from Galicia. She's from Panama. Quite brilliant writer, actually. And in my fantasy, she asked me, so this demographic transition wasn't a surprise? And it was not. This was the dominant textbook all the way up to the early 1960s. It was written by Warren Thompson in 1930. He laid out the demographic transition and predicted everything that is happening. This is what I was taught in school. Oddly, Warren Thompson's picture isn't even available on the web today. He's been so forgotten. So Nicole asks, then how did this change come to be? Most people focus today on Moore's law, the exponential decrease in the cost of computing. I, however, like to start with obsidian. This was the first internationally traded good. It was also a storage of wealth, which gave way ultimately to other forms of wealth storage, money. and eventually to accounting, which turned into writing, which enabled science and philosophy and the Enlightenment that started with Aristotle, went through Aquinas, Descartes, Locke, Newton, Leibniz, Spinoza, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Smith, and we'll posit Menger because Menger observed the natural law that we as investors live by, supply and demand. This is an internal process that simply means that another additional unit of anything is valued less than the one before it. There is, however, an exemption to the law of supply and demand, and that's time, that's health. In fact, what we actually observe as people get older, that next minute is more valuable than the one before it. And this is the basis of life, of time. It's the DNA that all living things share. And this is running what we're seeing around us. Speaking of DNA, the straight line on the top of this chart is a logarithmic representation of the exponential drop in the price of computing. The green line represents the cost of sequencing a genome. In fact, it's come down quite a bit since this chart was made. So we see, in fact, that biotech costs are dropping at a much faster rate than Moore's law. And this applies in many other areas. However, since we're talking about sequencing genomes, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Michael West, the father of regenerative medicine, who founded Geron, now runs Biotime. And in this picture, he's actually culturing cells taken from the inside of my left arm. One of his subsidiaries, LifeMap Sciences, collaborates with the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv to keep the master databank of all genetic knowledge. So with this knowledge, Michael West actually had my genome sequenced. This is a graphical representation of my genome called a circos. I would really recommend to you that you have this done. Having your genome sequenced is incredibly interesting. Somewhat disturbing at times, but also fascinating. And it's actually changed the way I think about a lot of my own characteristics. I should say, however, that Eric Schadt, who is the leading genomicist in the world today, has made a point of debunking the linear model of genetic action. One gene doesn't do anything on its own. There are systems. That said, the atonal homolog 7 gene is really interesting, and I have this SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. And what this represents, in fact, is a particularly large contribution of Neanderthal genes. This gene has been called the idiot savant gene. It seems to deliver superior ability to concentrate, but at the cost of skills in dealing with humans, Homo sapiens. And this didn't actually surprise my wife. This is a really interesting gene, SNP. It's the cholesterol ester transfer protein gene. This genotype is often called the Ashkenazi mutation because it is found, when it is rarely found, usually among very old Ashkenazi Jews. It seems to deliver a resistance to heart attack, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, and it's pretty remarkable that I have it, but it's even more remarkable that John Malden has it, and the people who did our genomes were frankly stunned that either of us have it, let alone both. The odds against it are quite high. Essentially, it means we have enormous cholesterol. There are other impacts as well, but that's easily observable. It keeps, in fact, cholesterol from forming plaques. This gene, the catechol-O-methyltransferase gene allele, causes massive production of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. This has some advantages, also the ability to focus and concentrate. However, it's called the worrying or the coward's gene, in fact. Dopamine you might think of as speed. Anybody who does speed very long essentially becomes scared. So I, in fact, relate very strongly to the words of one of the great American musicians, Taj Mahal, who said, "If you ain't scared, you ain't right." And it's my experience that most people are afraid of something. And primarily it's change. One of the things people are worried about, the so-called singularity, is that machine intelligence will outstrip human intelligence. This is James Cameron's Terminator vision. The man who came up with that word, the singularity, was in fact John von Neumann. And this was not his vision. He never said this, though many of the people who have come since then claim that the singularity as invented refers to machine intelligence. I think they do that because they don't understand how primitive microchips are compared to DNA. Eric Schadt, whom I mentioned earlier, believes, in fact, that we don't have just 4 nucleobases delivering a quaternary storage system in DNA. He believes we may have more than 20, that there are only 4 categories of nucleobases. This increases the level of complexity in terms of DNA differentiation, just impossibly. So let's talk about some of the power of DNA as opposed to machines. You'll notice in this mouse there's a cable running from its head, and there are a few electrodes inserted into the brain of that animal and then connected over the internet to another mouse. Now these mice have been trained to push a lever corresponding to a light. You'll see that this animal has a light. This animal doesn't, but it's pushing a lever that corresponds to the light. These animals were hooked together, and within a very short amount of time were feeding themselves pellets by pushing the right lever. This is DNA. There was no computer program helping. This is just a direct connection between 2 animals. This is a better example of the power of our own genomes. This woman had very few electrodes inserted into her movement center. They were connected to a robot movement system. Within a few hours, she was feeding herself. The same experiment was done at Brown University. The researchers were so astounded by the rapidity of her ability to learn to control a robotic arm. They asked her how she did it. She said, "Move your arm," to a researcher. He did, and she asked, "How did you do that?" I think the reason that von Neumann didn't believe that machines would outstrip humans is that he actually worked in biology as well as physics. He discovered the mechanism of DNA replication. And what he actually said was, the ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs, as we know them, could not continue. The key word here is progress. It's not machine intelligence. And this is the source of that progress. So let's talk about DNA. And this is just background. George Church, renowned genomist, geneticist from MIT and Harvard, recently wrote a book. And he printed that book in DNA. As well as sequencing a genome, you can write genetic information. And he printed this book with its illustrations and animated GIFs and sent it to California from Boston, where it was read and printed in paper. In fact, he printed 70 billion copies of this book, which outstrips all other known books combined. The interesting thing was that DNA is so compact that that 70 billion book pile of DNA dust could fit on your fingernail. So this is important because I want you to understand how dense that information is. A molecular biologist who made his bones in the United Kingdom, Inc. magazine Entrepreneur of the Year a few years ago. He should have been retired at this point. Incredibly successful, intelligent man. But he was on vacation with his family and ordered a drug be delivered to a hotel for his son who has a very rare genetic disease. Because of his background in the pharmaceutical industry, he saw something about the packaging that alerted him to the fact that something was off. He called the manufacturer, who said, "Don't use that drug, we didn't send it." In fact, it very well could have killed his son. Other people took it and their lives were damaged, sometimes permanently. So he began to think about a solution to counterfeit drugs. What he came upon was some sort of super barcode. If you could put a barcode on every item, every product that you wanted to protect that was unbreakable and copyable, then you could at any time validate, authenticate that item. And he found a solution in plant DNA. I won't go into the math, but you can pause and read this if you would like. Essentially, however, plant DNA is so complex, you can mark a product with the Library of Congress and pick the number of typos from which books you will use as a key to actually authenticate an item. The one-time pad encoding technology is a pretty good metaphor. It's also incredibly durable. Scientists have read DNA hundreds of thousands of years old, and this company has modified that technology to mark real products. In fact, This DNA marking is more durable than the goods that it is put on. The Patel Corporation. This company was doing business in Europe. They were protecting cash transfers in the city of London, jewelry and copper in Sweden, and expanding at a very reasonable rate. Something happened to change that, and this is an actual picture of a failed THAAD missile. When investigators determined the cause of this failure, they found 30% of the chips in the military system were counterfeit, and this is typical across the board. Costing almost $3 million, the Pentagon was motivated to task the Defense Logistics Agency with finding a solution to this terrible problem. And the problem is bigger than simply counterfeiting for money. So foreign intelligence agencies are constantly trying to get backdoors into American products for sabotage or information gathering. This is a very serious cybersecurity issue. Their response was to mandate the use of this DNA marking technology for the critical electronics supply line for all military products. The providers of these components weren't happy, so the Pentagon said, fine, we'll pay for it. This is the only mandated, subsidized monopoly of any consequence that I've ever even heard of. This is a remarkable technology, and it's a remarkable investment opportunity. Besides chips, the Defense Department now is in the process of beginning to look into marking other products, including IDs. And that's an important point, because with this technology and a hand scanner, we put an end to any kind of counterfeit identification. Money can be marked with this technology, though I expect governments to be the last people to actually adopt it for something practical. This is a 3D sculpture, and in fact, this plant DNA integrated into 3D printer technology provides a way to authenticate the validity of even 3D products. This will be important later on. So what is the impact of this in terms of the economy? The International Chamber of Commerce has estimated that counterfeiting may be as high as $1.7 trillion a year. It's probably high, and certainly this won't do anything to stop digital counterfeiting. So let's call it $1 trillion. Direct theft, more in other countries than North America, is probably another 10% of GDP. So we're really looking at 20% of global GDP suffering loss due to crime and counterfeiting. European cash and transit customers report 3/4 reduction in their theft losses using this technology, and 100% conviction rate. Scandinavians have even higher reductions in theft of metal when using this authentication technology. What I predict, and what others predict, is that eventually all products will adopt this authentication technology. You'll have a scanner in your phone. You can take a look at any product and know immediately with 100% confidence what it is and where it came from. And you could throw in the Brandenburg Concertos in this marker as well if you wanted to. This is going to change the world. Property crime is so reduced, law enforcement can turn to preventing violent crime. Worldwide GDP will increase significantly and permanently with long-term exponential compounded impacts. The world is changing. Here's another example of what has come from understanding DNA. Dennis Graun and Craig Heller are Stanford University sleep researchers. And they were interested in how hibernating animals can deal with heat, because they're built to maintain heat in hibernation. And they solved an age-old anatomical puzzle called the retia venosa. We've always known about these densely packed veins in the palms of our hands, in the soles of our feet, and our snouts. But nobody knew what they were for. Heller and Graun realized that they're connected to an alternate circulatory system called the arteriovenous anastomosis, which is only activated when you overheat. At that point, your body stops sending blood to the muscles of your body, to your limbs, and sends it directly to the retia venosa, all 5 of them. This is heat exchange. It's your air conditioning system. That cooler blood is taken back to the core, where it's sequestered and saved to protect the brain and the heart. If you work out, you've hit the wall. The wall, in fact, is a safety mechanism because you can exercise to the point where you suffer substantial heat damage. This limits our ability to do work. It causes cellular damage that slows recovery, but this is the price we pay to prevent overheating, destruction of the brain and the other organs through overheating. This is Jonathan Garcia, an Olympic speed skater, using a device that these two scientists devised to rapidly take out excess heat, restore the body to normal, return blood flow to the muscles and the connective tissue. And essentially what this is, and I use this, John uses this, is a remarkable discovery that dramatically improves the effects of exercise. It works by putting water at a precise temperature through a perfusion pad on one of your retia venosa in a vacuum. So you see this rather clunky looking glove actually contains lowered atmospheric pressure with water through a pad at exactly the right temperature. So instead of taking 2 hours to cool if you're overheated, it takes minutes. But the benefits of this are really astonishing. Immediately when you're working out, you're going to see about a 30% increase in the ability to do work, because between sets when you're cooling, your body is recovering. You're not dealing with the wall any longer. Over a period of time, we see dramatic increases in strength and endurance, cardiovascular as well as anaerobic exercise. In fact, it's comparable to about 600 milligrams of Test-E, as it's called in the gym, testosterone enanthate. It was a significant steroidal supplement. However, this thermogenic cooling device, which accomplishes exactly the same thing, doesn't come with gynecomastia or any of the other very unpleasant side effects of steroids. And it works with aerobic exercise as well. I can't tell you how happy I am to be able to work out again at a level and intensity that I did when I was in my 20s. So let's move on to another disease that you didn't know you had. And this is Claudio Franceschi, gerontologist who coined the phrase inflammaging, referring to the inflammation generated by the immune system, which activated chronically begins to break down your body's cells and systems. In fact, 2 years ago, these three men won the Nobel Prize essentially for validating his work. The immune system is your friend when you're a young person. As you get older, it somehow forgets to turn off after being activated until we reach a point of constant, chronic, low-level inflammation. This tends to localize in one place, in one organ, and then what we have is failure and eventually death. In recent years, this inflammation has in fact been linked to accelerated aging over and over again. Multiple scientists have demonstrated this through a variety of means. This Yale study focuses here on NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is the alarm system of your immune system. When you're young, it goes off if you are injured or infected. However, as you get older, NF-kappa B is activated unnecessarily and sometimes constantly. This study links NF-kappa B activation in the hypothalamus to systemic aging acceleration. There's many of these. This is an actual representation of NF-kappa B from the side, from the top. And as you can see, this is more and more widely recognized. Obviously, these two people are not, in fact, suffering from advanced age-related inflammation. More to the point, the man in this picture is a reader and a friend of mine. He's, according to the New York Times, the only male supermodel. Brad Croning is his name. And he started sending me information about 3 or 4 years ago about a company that had supposedly found a solution to accelerated aging. And I gotta admit, when supermodels start talking science, I don't tend to listen. In this case, I should have listened to because I ignored him for at least 6 months. And what he was telling me, that a company had identified an alkaloid in the solanaceous plant family that moderated NF-kappa B activation without immune suppression. That's obviously impossible. I didn't believe it. However, ultimately, I gave in and started listening, and I found out that a hero of mine, Dr. Paul Ladenson, the head of endocrinology at Johns Hopkins, was involved in this research. And Dr. Ladenson had previously found, in fact, hints that there was something in the solanaceous plants, including tobacco, that had a remarkable efficacy in terms of inflammation. There was also a lot of data out of Scandinavia, decades of research regarding oral tobaccos. Roskamp Institute, the leading neurological research group in the world, eventually came into the picture, and they began to do research, which I will sort of summarize. They used tumor necrosis factor alpha, a common inflammatory agent in animals, and demonstrated in a dose-dependent fashion they could reduce it using this alkaloid, anatobine. They compared it to other common anti-inflammatories, from aspirin to Celebrex. It shut them down. Lipitor is nothing compared to this anti-inflammatory. So obviously at this point people are getting very interested. Further experiments showed that it generally reduces the C-reactive protein panels, which most of you have probably had done, and which doctors worry about as a risk factor for all kinds of diseases, especially heart disease. They showed that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and even inhibits amyloid beta levels, which is the core cause of Alzheimer's disease. It even increased the acuity, or the IQ of animals that have Alzheimer's, even advanced forms, as this study documents. They also showed that induced multiple sclerosis was significantly ameliorated by this alkaloid. And in several human studies, we have seen really historic data. This is the thyroiditis study, and what we see at the end of treatment is basically a reversal of symptoms, and I think that we can say that it is possible now to reverse thyroiditis. Roskamp has produced this slide, which shows the mechanism of action. Really what you need to focus on are the cytokines on the right side, the TNF-alphas, the interleukins, amyloids, which are produced in an inflammatory reaction. Now, some of those go back and reactivate NF-kappa B, and that's the problem. That's the vicious circle of chronic low-level inflammation. Somehow, this alkaloid stops that circle, but doesn't prevent the legitimate activation of your inflammatory response. People had mentioned the possibility that something like this might exist a few years ago, and it was simply dismissed. It would be too good to be true. It would be magic, alchemy. Now, the company got into a little bit of trouble. The inventor and CEO was caught up in a political scandal. He was never charged. The company was not blamed for anything, but it hurt the company to a certain extent. The head of Roskamp Institute today, Fiona Crawford, did experiments with animals and traumatic brain injury. And what she found was that if animals were given severe concussions, and then part of that population given anatobine citrate in this case, they suffered no long-term repercussions, no memory loss, no brain damage. This was presented at Neuroscience, very important neurological meeting, and a lot of people wrote about it. It's not surprising that something like this would get a lot of attention. The company linked to it, and the FDA said, you can't do that. So at the moment they are in fact negotiating whether or not they continue over the counter as they take this compound into drug trials. We could talk about some of the many inflammation-related diseases that I believe this alkaloid will treat. But I think the real point of this technology is that it will extend the healthy portion of your life. It will get you closer to your Hayflick limit. This is the hard-coded limit to how many times your cells replicate. The mechanism of the Hayflick limit are the telomeres, shown here in red. You can think of telomeres as the nubs at the bottom of zippers. When a cell replicates DNA, the double helix separates, stays together at the telomere, and then comes back together. Every time it does that, it uses a telomere. And when you run out of telomeres, you run out of life. At this point, maximum lifespan is about 120 years. If you're suffering from inflammation, you have a faster rate of cell replication, so you don't experienced that upper limit. This technology, among others that I'll discuss briefly, I think will substantially improve the probability that you will live a much longer, healthier life. So another disease you didn't know you had. This is Alexander Ivanovich Oparin, one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century. He was the head of the Soviet Institute of Biotechnology and had an obsession with plant sugars. Eventually, he handed this over to his protege, Anatol Klyosov, who similarly was chosen by the Soviet science machine as the best biologist in the entire Soviet empire. Anatol, who's actually a friend of mine today, came after the fall of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, to Harvard. And at that time, scientists were just discovering a mechanism by which cancers protect themselves from the immune system. And these are galectin-3 proteins. They express proteins that bind to T cells and shut them down. It prevents communication with the immune system, and it literally kills T cells. Judging simply from the shape of these molecules, he thought it might be possible to block that binding with plant sugars that he and Oparin had discovered. So he sent back to Russia for a sample of these plant sugars, and when tested on animals, he found, in fact, that's exactly what happens. This is a more recent example performed by the prestigious Ludwig Institute, showing in a dish of T cells and cancers, the cancers immediately shut down the T cells. When these plant sugars were added, the T cells were rejuvenated and killed the cancer cells. More interestingly, however, when animal tests were performed, in the post-mortems, the animals were examined, they found a very surprising thing. Normally, the combination of cancer and a chemo drug would cause fibrosis, sclerosis of the liver, the kidney, and many other organs. In these animals that had been given these plant sugars, however, we saw baby pink, fresh, youthful organs, livers, kidneys, lungs, everything. Since then, they have proven this in kidneys, in pulmonary fibrosis, lungs, and this is a critically important discovery because almost half of all organ failures, all deaths, involve to a significant effect fibrosis, which really is just scarification. This impacts, by the way, skin as well, which raises really interesting possibilities in terms of the value of this company. This is the results of the most serious patients in the recently completed first cohort of patients in a phase 1 safety study using this compound. Despite the very low doses, those patients with the most advanced form of fatty liver disease, NASH, actually experienced a reduction in cell death. This is the reversal of sclerosis. And the markers showed reduction in fibrosis and everything else we want to see. This is world-changing. These are mitochondria. Mitochondrial dysfunction is another disease you probably didn't know you had. Mitochondria are, in essence, bacteria that live in our cells. Their job is to convert food to energy, adenosine triphosphate. As we age, however, the efficiency of that mechanism falls. These tiny organelles actually have their own DNA, separate from the genome in the nucleus. In fact, you only get them from your mother in the placental fluids. Fascinating structures that are critical to our lives. When Adolf Krebs first discovered the process called the citric acid cycle by which our body turns food into adenosine triphosphate, ATP, usable biological energy. He wondered what would happen if he augmented oxaloacetate, which is a part of the Krebs cycle. When he did that, he got an 800% increase in ATP production. However, at that time, oxaloacetate had to be stored at minus 30 degrees Celsius. Therefore, no one considered actually using it as a supplement. Recently, however, a means of stabilizing oxaloacetate at room temperature has been found. What this means is that the Krebs cycle can be upgraded simply by taking a few simple pills a day. This has enormous implications for reversing the mitochondrial dysfunction that we suffer as we're old. Perhaps just as interesting, it also appears that boosting the NAD plus to NADH ratio, and I recommend you do research, the Khan Academy is a great place to do this, also activates the sirtuin pathways. These are the pathways that are normally only activated during calorie restriction, which is a very unpleasant way to live. At least 30% of the genes express proteins when you're on an optimally nutritious starvation diet. This is associated in animals, including lower order primates, with much longer lives. So we're very interested in this very hot area of research. The company that provided the materials that John and I are using is called Benagene, but there are other ways to do this. Benagene happens to have been around the longest, the safest. But we're interested in this very interesting new area of science. Briefly, I'm going to touch on a technology that also uses circular plasmid bacterial DNA. And this is Inovio Pharmaceuticals. They managed to get re-engineered plasmids into cells using electroporation, which forces the cell walls to open long enough to get these little protein machines in. Once activated, transcription begins, and they produce proteins continually like a model railroad. Virtually any protein that you want to design, they can. And in a type of inoculation, similar to old smallpox inoculations, they can turn your own body into a protein manufacturing device. Now they're going after cancers, malaria, and I think they'll get that. They're funded by the Bill Gates Foundation. But more interesting than that is, to me at least, is growth hormone releasing hormone, because their animal subsidiary in Australia has used this hundreds of thousands of times with complete safety. You know, a few years ago, people started talking about growth hormone, and it's the fountain of youth. And in many ways it is. Your skin thickens, wrinkles disappear, you lose belly fat, you gain muscle, energy increases. However, it has side effects because it's being administered exogenously, outside of the regulatory system. I would not recommend taking it. On the other hand, what we see in animals who are given this inoculation of growth hormone releasing hormone plasmids is that they produce maximum growth hormone along with insulin-like growth factor, along with all of the other hormones that it's needed to be safe. The impacts are better skin, less fat, more muscle, higher acuity and fertility, but most importantly, all these animals outlive untreated animals in their cohort significantly. This is a very important life extension technology that I'll be telling you about in the future. At the current time, the FDA does not accept life extension as a legitimate goal. However, I think that's going to change. What we want, what increasingly people want, is youthful health. However, all of these technologies don't overcome the Hayflick limit. You eventually run out of telomeres. Now the big news. A few weeks ago, you may have seen a study where doctors used embryonically derived mouse cells to rejuvenate damaged heart muscle in other animals. This made a lot of news because currently heart muscle doesn't repair. If you have a heart attack, you're just left with less heart. In this case, we see it can be reversed in animals. I'd just like to read this paragraph for you. A scientist commenting on this experiment said, "In the future, it may be possible to take snippets of a patient's skin or blood and turn those cells into induced pluripotent stem cells. These stem cells could presumably regenerate heart muscle without the risk of being rejected by the body. The challenge there will be to speed up the culturing process. It takes weeks or months to generate enough cells for the injections." I don't know if this scientist doesn't keep up with the news or is simply promoting his own work, but Biotime is far into this process. This journal article, in fact, documents the company's successful reversion of adult cells to induce pluripotent stem cells. This is Michael West, the CEO and scientist behind Biotime. In this picture, he's actually culturing fibroblasts, skin cells from inside my left arm. These are the fibroblasts. And this is part of a convergence of several different sciences, both genomics and regenerative medicine. But in this case, he rejuvenated my cells by taking them back to their youthful state with the full complement of telomeres, meaning they were essentially 0 years old. This is a picture of my induced pluripotent stem cells. They're identical to the cells that I came from. In fact, each one of those cells could be turned into another me. More importantly, Biotime has mapped the embryo. That is, they have figured out how this one cell that all life begins with becomes all the other cells in your body. And they've patented processes for hundreds of these different cell types. We decided to do cardiomyocytes. I happen to be the first person in the world ever to see their own rejuvenated heart muscle cells beating outside of the body. This journal article covers numerous experiments with a delivery mechanism, a matrix that Biotime has used repeatedly. My point is simply that they could put a graft inside your heart to slowly release these heart muscle cells. So the implementation of this technology would be far more efficient than the experiments with the mice. In fact, Biotime is the master of IP. Recently, they acquired all of the IP from Geron on top of all of the other critical components in the patents for stem cell medicine. Here we have a list of Biotime's subsidiaries. The jewel in the crown here is Recite, for the simple reason that this is the first company that has ever declared as its stated purpose the reversal of aging. This is not the treatment of a disease. The point of this company is to develop the cells that will rejuvenate the cardiovascular system. And their target is the endothelium. Gerontologists have a saying which is, you are as old as your endothelium. This is the thin layer of cells inside your cardiovascular system. These cells, when you're young and you're healthy, are smooth and functioning, and they prevent the buildup of plaque. They also produce nitric oxide. They signal its production anyway, so that vasodilation is easy and efficient. Vasodilation is a response to the need for more oxygen or nutrients. Blood flow increases. As we age, however, the endothelium loses function. Hypertension is one result. Plaque is another. ED, macular degeneration, the list seems almost endless. And this contributes to the primary cause of death, which is heart disease, but also stroke and many other diseases. In cows, Dr. Michael West has actually done a procedure where rejuvenated endothelial precursor cells were given to the animal. They migrated to the bones of the legs and then began to replace the endothelium. This will be done in humans. When it does, it means that we will see the end of cardiovascular disease as we know it. You might think of it as a non-surgical heart and artery transplant. I looked for a picture of these cells, but most people wouldn't know the difference. For all practical purposes, this might as well be the Philosopher's Stone of Harry Potter, because it will save your life if you are predisposed to heart disease. Now I'd like to talk about the most recent addition to that circle of Biotime subsidiaries. That's LifeMap Solutions, the most interesting new development in regenomics. Remember Eric Schadt, whom I talked about earlier, the most important genomicist in the world. Eric was funded by Carl Icahn to establish a center at Mount Sinai. And the reason that Dr. Schadt chose Mount Sinai is that they have the biggest group of opt-in medical patients in his field. He has tens of thousands of medical records, including completely sequenced genomes. For a genomist, this is a gold mine because it allows cross-correlation and analysis of genomes with diseases. He is now working with Dr. Michael West to bring a mobile health app to your phone. Now, in this mobile app, eventually, and they're not saying this yet, I'm predicting it, it says your avatar will exist in the cloud, a genetically precise copy of you, cross-correlated with all the information generated from all the other sequenced genomes and all of the science, so that as risks develop, you will be informed of them. As cures develop, you will be informed. And in many cases, if you need cells to prevent or to fix problems, they will be prepared as a result of this new enterprise. So let's talk a little bit about the gorilla in the room and why I believe that these changes are coming faster than almost anybody expects. And that's the baby boom. As lifespans increase, health costs increase, using conventional medicine at least. This is a BioTime slide projecting the increase in health costs. We can't afford to pay the healthcare costs we have now, but they're going to get much higher. The baby boom is probably the last biggest and richest generation in history. As populations continue to fall, their influence is unique, and they have always got what they wanted. So what do they want? Clearly they want youthful health. And for the first time in history, it's possible to give a people that and to reduce their medical costs. By the way, the alchemical goal of converting mercury to gold has been in many times. This is an abstract of an experiment in 1941 to that end. I actually think that carbon nanotubes better fit the goals of the early alchemists, but we've come a long way since then. The other two goals of the alchemists, of course, were the discovery of universal cures for disease and a means of indefinitely prolonging life. Clearly, we are seeing cures for diseases that could never before be treated. In fact, diseases we didn't even know we were suffering from. But now regenerative medicine is coming online very rapidly. Japan has already essentially deregulated stem cell medicine. The baby boom in America is going to demand the same thing as it becomes evident that there are cures that they're being kept from using. When that happens, medical care costs go down, but productive lives and portfolio lives continue to grow. Therefore, the big cause of our societal economic problems, the impossibility of funding a growing cohort of older people, is solved. So this is important not only to us as investors, that we take advantage of these new technologies, but also to society in general. So let's talk about doom again. What I'm saying is optimistic. However, I accept the fact that this transition, this Schumpeterian turnover, is going to be painful if you're not prepared for it. Governments show no sign of recognizing the limits of what they can do. Therefore, they will have to fail. But we will have a new system that works, and we will have the technologies to increase the quality and length of life dramatically. The danger for investors today is not to recognize this remarkable transformation. If there is long-term doom, it is for those who don't have the ability to recognize the reality of these remarkable transformational changes that are coming on us. For those who do, however, they will have the opportunity to profit enormously personally, and they will know when to accept and to seek out these therapies. Welcome to the new age of alchemy.